welcome. Today, I have the privilege of talking with Melinda Chinen. She's a grief and life coach with a background in social work, and she is currently residing in San Diego, California. She's also a wonderful kindred spirit, and I believe that we connected through our energetic footprint with the assistance of the Instagram algorithm. Her beautiful energy, her work, and her art reveal much about her story and philosophy about life, death, and life after life. So I'm thrilled to share a glimpse of her wonderful wisdom with you today. Thank you, Melinda, for being here, and welcome to the Grief and Life podcast.
Thank you, Nina. That was beautiful.
You're amazing. So I want to start in light of the events that are happening right now, because it's hard not to acknowledge this. At the time that we are recording this podcast, there's been an awful tragedy in Lāhainā, Maui, which has reportedly claimed the lives of 100 people. I know you have your strong ties with Hawai'i, and you were recently in Oahu, I believe. Share whatever's on your heart about that particular topic, and then we can go on to more about your story.
Thank you so much for bringing that up and honoring that, because it is heavily something I'm grieving with family and friends. Yeah, being born and raised on Oahu, I think every Hawaii person, and I think any person indigenous to a culture, can affirm that you just feel all your people like in every cell of your body.
Yes.
And having left Hawaii, living in California, I know better now after all this time has passed that there is no distance or separation from me and others and me and the land. So it has been such a challenging time. And I've been learning a lot about collective grief and kind of recognizing the patterns of how everyone who witnesses tragedy from afar can feel that ache. But because we live in a society that hasn't taught us how to grieve and how to identify even our own grief, there's just been a lot of intricacies to what's happening on Maui that I think reflects to that larger stigma that we have that's making it hard for all of us to mourn meaningfully and rebuild. So just wanted to acknowledge that. But
no, thank you for sharing that. The closest thing that I feel like I can relate to was when Hurricane Maria hit the island of Puerto Rico. So I'm from Puerto Rico, for those who don't know. And there was no communication with our loved ones for 2 weeks minimum, I feel like, if I remember correctly. And just feeling what you said, that collective grief and witnessing it from afar is actually very difficult, especially when you have a connection with the land and the people and your ancestors. So there's layers upon layers upon layers. And it's nothing short of awful. They need all the help they can get. I will link some resources in the show notes just, for easy access, but it's something that's present in our hearts. So we'll dedicate this episode to everything that's happening and give it some beautiful energy today. One thing I want to ask you, how did you end up in the grief workspace? How did you end up as a grief and life coach? And where did this all start for you?
Thank you. I think there's two parts to this story. One being I grew up really intuitive and very sensitive. So there was actually a part of me from 15 years old that just knew that I was going to work in the death and dying space. And I remember that moment, you're conditioned by life telling you just be rational. And I was like, why do I feel this in my heart? But I feel like the only way I could do this is if I went to medical school, and that does not feel right either. So I just let it go. I had no clue that I would actually end up here. And then the other part of the story is just from really life-changing experiences. My first taste of real grief was witnessing one of my best friends die. And she battled cancer for a whole year. Actually, she battled cancer when we were kids, and then it came back when we were adults. That experience, how could anyone be the same? It wasn't just those 3 days of watching her actually decline. It was witnessing a whole year of someone come to life and realize how precious this human experience is. So I spent a year after she passed in deep grief, but did not know it because of my own lack of awareness around what grief really is. But I think it was also one of the most meaningful years of my life because I reckoned with every part of me that could not be this people pleaser anymore. I always say this. I think grief breaks you down and then it breaks you open. And after that deep year of depression, I met a coach, a life coach, very randomly, and she helped me propel my life in a way that I didn't know was possible, not even in social work. And what began as me life coaching ended up me doing a grief coaching certification as well. And it has been 4 years of just picking up every breadcrumb and following that same intuition I had at 15. I feel like that was restored from my experience of grief. And here I am. Yeah, I just fundamentally believe that this life is precious. And the way that I witnessed Paige fight for her life showed me that even without a disease, I am also dying. And it is up to me every day to make this time worthwhile.
That's beautifully stated. And with Paige, I remember one of the initial conversations that we had, you mentioned she was like a sister, really. She's a friend, but she's really like a sister. You grew up together. So you have a lifetime of memories with Paige. So witnessing that last year of her dying, which I also appreciate what you said. We are all in our dying process. We just don't know when that final chapter is going to be, essentially. But that has a very powerful effect when it's so vivid and so active in our lives, whether it's happening to us or something that we're witnessing in somebody else. I found a quote. It's something you said that I just absolutely love. It says, "When grief brings you to your knees, it's because it is designed to." And that is so powerful. That is so, so powerful. Before we get into the nitty gritty, how would you define grief coaching? Because I learned about that this was like a thing after my brother's passing. But prior to that, I had no idea this even existed. So what is grief coaching? What do you offer? What is it to you?
I love that question. To know grief coaching is actually to first know what life coaching is. And to me, in that essence, is life coaching is all about the present and the future, which makes it, there's some overlay with therapy, but therapy is largely about looking at the past and really helping to alchemize and move through and heal deep childhood wounds. The essence of coaching is just asking the right questions and reflecting to someone who they really are so that they can choose in every next moment from their values. So something that I find really interesting is with grief, even though we talk about the past, and even though we talk about our loved ones, the experience of grief is actually a present experience. It comes up in the present and it hits you over the head. And I think it's in those moments we don't know how to be with it. Our culture has been in survival mode for so long that when something as sacred as grief arises, we look at it as something that's wrong rather than part of our nature, part of our humanity that's arising to teach us something. I look at myself as someone who is walking right alongside someone in their grief journey. Like we're just walking in a forest together. And it's my job to ask the questions to help their grief come out fully and teach them that this is completely safe to feel. And the more that you actually make space for your grief, the more that you get to know it as not this stranger that's here to hurt you, but as a part of your humanity that's trying to restore something. I think people inherently recognize the importance of that. Otherwise, I don't think my business would have stood a chance this far. But I think grief coaching in its essence is restoring people's nature and helping them learn that underneath all the grief are values that they really want to live from. And so it's that process. It's like, can you grieve and can you rebuild a future you did not know you think you could have from loss?
That is so beautifully stated. Grief is an alchemical process. It's a way of rebuilding into something that you didn't even know was there. You were not aware. It's a coming home of sorts, but it's also this place where you can dream. And this might sound like absolute nonsense to somebody in early grief, perhaps, but when you go through the initial process, when you allow yourself to feel, when you have to go through that really mucky, painful, heavy phases in order to be able to have these realizations a little bit later down the line. If and when a person allows themselves to do that, and I would argue that we need the help of other people in order to see that. It is possible to do it yourself, but I think it's a better experience when you do it in community or with a grief coach or somebody walking alongside you. That if and when you get to that space of possibility, life is never the same. Your life is already not the same through loss. So why not make that into this life possibility? I don't know if that's necessarily the right word.
Yeah, well, that you reminded me of something else that I inherently believe to be true about grief, which is grief. Grief is not a problem to be fixed. It just wants to be witnessed, right? So when we think about doing our own grieving work with other people, I see it as almost essential. Like we just need to witness each other, not fix each other. And that's how we feel.
Huge, 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 because as a griever, people want to get you back to what you used to be. And I'm using air quotes because that person is inherently gone for all intents and purposes. They're as gone as a person you lost. So it's like there is nothing necessarily left to go back to. It's like, how do we move forward? A bit like what's happening in Lāhainā. Life as people knew it is gone. So to say, hey, let's go back to what was, you can't. So it's like, how do you rebuild from what is here now? And that's a very painful reality. Another quote I want to bring on along that line, something that you said, you just have the best quotes. You said, we live in a grief, dying, and death-fearing world. The impact of that is that we avoid fully living. And when we avoid fully living, we numb our pulse and we make choices from a place of surviving. So let me read that again, just because I kind of stumbled on it a little bit. So we live in a grief, dying, and death-fearing world. The impact of that is that we avoid fully living. And when we avoid fully living, we numb our pulse and we make choices from a place of surviving. There's so much to unpack there, starting with why are we so grief averse? Like, what is it about dying and not wanting to witness the death process? Why are we like this? I feel like that's a broad question, but why are we like this?
I think at the core of it, death symbolizes the absolute unknown. And historically, our society has advanced. Everything in its advancement is to have more stability and more control. But I think when we are so focused on just that, we forget that a large part of living is just being and surrender and trusting, and that life has a pulse of its own. So there's a lot of layers, but I think that's the simplest way I can look at it. It really is about our relationship with control and the way that we really interact and dance with this whole human experience. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. The other side of that spectrum would be to surrender, I imagine, and to live a life of surrendering to what is, to your nature, to, in a way, welcoming softness and not knowing and being okay with not knowing. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I think, and this is coming from someone who is, I can't even believe I'm doing this work because I am like a recovering perfectionist, people pleaser, codependent, like wanting control. It's just been a vice for me my whole life, right? And I think it's a product of also feeling so unsafe from a young age, but not having the language or awareness to cultivate safety, right, in my terms. So I have a lot of empathy for our society and our world that is aching for control. I think, though, what I've learned the hard way, and especially from loss, is that when you are just aching for control outside of yourself, it's a reflection of how much you've self-abandoned in order to feel okay. And so a lot of what I've learned from loss, and it might sound pretty harsh when I say it like this, but I think it stands true after everything I've been through, is everything is allowed to leave me as long as I never leave myself. Because we come into this earth alone and we will leave alone but connected, right? So I really think that at the end of the day, nothing is guaranteed. That's just a reality. That's no fantasy. But life really is a dance of, can I live by my values and then trust the rest? I think that's it. Live by my values and trust the rest. Because even if you live with your perception of perfection, right? Like a lot of people are like, but I did everything right. Why didn't it guarantee this? Why didn't my marriage work? Why didn't this happen? Why didn't I get the job? That's life being life, right? So at that point, it's just about acknowledging, like, I gave it my all and things still don't happen the way I want it to. Can I surrender to that?
And that takes a lot of self-awareness, I would argue, a lot of inner work at times. And that surrendering, I have found it's easier said than done, and it is a process. So part of that is why having this guidance along the way is so powerful, to be able to practice embodiment, like coming back to yourself, to your body, to your life in a way that feels safe. And safe is a word that I hear over and over in coaching and groups and therapy and all these things, because sometimes we feel unsafe within ourselves, within our lives, within our reality, within our feelings. So if we feel unsafe, our mind is going to try to protect us from everything. And how do you recommend that your clients find a way to come back home to themselves? Walk us through your process.
It's a very big question. One I'm still peeling away at. And I'm curious also, you've done a lot of inner work. So
Still am, yes.
same, have done and still doing. It's a big question. Have you ever heard that quote, first God drops a pebble, then he drops a brick?
I have not.
I think about that a lot. I think every person has a pebble and every person has a brick. And while I would never wish pain on anyone, I think it is a part of life that is here to break us open. And I think as a society, we are all conditioned to be motivated from either consequences or rewards. And a lot of us begin to live for the rewards by first needing to put out fires of the consequences of our life. So I think it does not necessarily matter the healing modality as much as when you start to awaken to an inner truth because your brick fell and you could finally receive it. That is the place to continue nurturing and continuing to make space for, because that will guide you to every next step. Because as you and I both know, the healing journey never stops.
It's a constant evolution, whether you're grieving or not. I feel like life has its own timing and you have to trust that timing. That was a big lesson. That's something I'm still learning. And I created literally a grief podcast and a space for this because I believe in this so much. There's such a strong force for you to be a certain way. And that becomes the evidence, at least it did for me, when I lost my brother. And I felt so adamant that no, this new reality is calling me to do something drastically different, turn inward, do all this work. And yet, work is calling me to do something. My family's calling me to be a certain way. My friends are calling me to be a certain way. And it's essentially that tug of war between forces and spaces, external and internal, about what next, what now, right?
Yeah. And actually, what I heard you describe was almost like a defrosting into true self. That ironically can invite even more loss. Because whatever was holding up your old life, who you were, who you attracted, will change the more you soften and come home to yourself and listen to your grief. And I think it's also a reason why a lot of people avoid grief, is they don't want more loss. And I've compassion for that, but there's a wisdom when things fall to the side. It gives you a chance to come back to the center.
And I know you've done work with terminally ill or people that are evidently closer to their transition date, if you will. How have you built your capacity to be witness to that, a space holder? And how have you achieved that? Because oftentimes I feel like I can hold space for people, but even with what I know today, I think it would be very difficult to be that close. So how have you built yourself up to the point to be able to hold that type of space?
One of my favorite feelings on earth is the experience of honesty and being with people where they're just completely honest. And I think that's what I love most about grief. I don't like the experience of grief. I think it's naturally so painful, but it makes even the most performative people honest. It made me super honest. They are the most honest. They are the most honest and they're the most alive because they're the ones that are most present to time is all that I have. Like, I can't take it for granted. So I think it's about where I've shifted my mindset, because a younger version of me definitely would have just absorbed the natural heartache. I think that comes from knowing you're dying. And I would have been so focused on that. But me now knows that if I look just a few layers deeper into that person, the thing that I admire most is their pulse is fully alive. They're so honest. They're here to give it their all, and at the very least, just settle into what breath they have left. It's an honor to witness. It just is.
From what I hear, you see that exchange as a witnessing, but of their honesty. It's so untouched. It's so pure. It's so untainted. It's just this really raw, beautiful energy that comes at an interesting point in people's lives. You learned 3 things from the terminally ill about relationships, purpose, and spirituality. And this whole authenticity portion and honesty portion of it fits in there. What about spirituality? Could you tell us about people closer to their state of transition?
Oh boy, I have a lot to say about spirituality. I fundamentally believe that there is so much more to this fishbowl than what meets the eye. And I've worked with a lot of people who have lost loved ones, who've received many spiritual messages, spiritual guidance. And likewise, I think before people pass, they are the most open and surrendered, and therefore experience a lot of spiritual experiences. I think it's always there. I think it's just a matter of us like really being open enough to receive all of life, not just the literal experience. And it just adds a magic and a romance to the fullness of what life is about.
I love that. I completely agree with you. Through my personal experience with the loss of my brother, I have never felt closer to whatever comes afterwards, right? However people want to define that, I think that's less important than knowing that there is an after. And about the spirituality and the guidance, I have felt that fully, from dreams to signs to sounds. I would credit this experience with making me more sensitive to receiving all of these messages, right? So I would imagine that somebody closer to their transition is more attuned to this reality of what's next, what's outside of the fishbowl, like you said. It's like when you're seeing a sunset, and I know me and you both love sunsets. So when we're seeing a beautiful sunset and you're looking into the horizon and you're seeing that space where the ocean touches the sky, living in that beautiful in-between space of pure magic where you just have no words, but you feel life so fully.
Yep, that is so beautifully said.
Thank you. And what's your philosophy with coaching? I feel like you've shared bits and pieces of that throughout the conversation.
Oh, sure. I live by this quote. I think it applies to both grief and life, and it is by Martha Beck. Have you ever heard of her?
I have heard of her, yes.
Okay. Yeah, she's been my greatest teacher through grief. And she always says, when you stop doing things by the struggle of your individual will and you fall into your nature, the power of nature itself has intentions and a design for you, and it will pick you up like a river.
Wow.
I know, right?
Wow. There's so much to unpack there. That was beautiful.
There is. And that has been the lesson of my life. Again, I think as a recovering perfectionist, people pleaser, codependent, I overfunctioned a lot and thought that that's how I was supposed to get everything that I wanted. And loss had a way of humbling me and making me realize that the doing part of my life is so separate than the being part of my life, if that makes sense. Like I can do a bunch of things, but when you come home and you feel empty, like that's actually says way more. And coaching to me is so restoring because it's all about focusing on who you're being in your life and that influencing your doing. So my number one job every single day in my work, in my personal life, in my relationships, is to stop forcing things, to not do things by the struggle of my individual will, and instead just fall all the way back into my nature. So I live my life for my intuition. I built my business from my intuition, and I help others live a life from their intuition, from their deepest nature.
We are taught, especially in Western society, we're taught to hustle, and you got to do things this way, and you have a limited amount of time, and there's this sense of urgency, and you got to do it yesterday, and there's no breaks, and there's no sleep, and there's no rest. We have internalized that to a degree that now is backfiring, I would argue, around society as a whole, because things are changing. I would dare say the pandemic was the eye opener, a turning point in that realization. And with what you said about like leaning into your place of the spring within you, that's the image that came to mind, the spring within you of what comes naturally, not what you're forcing, not what you should do, not what your family expects you to do, but just who you are. And in order to find that, I would argue you have to do some work to quiet everything else outside of you.
Absolutely. The amount of self-loathing and chaos that was existing within me before I ever touched any of this work, I'm like, how was I ever going to make it? Even if things looked good on paper, I think the voice of criticism, the voice of shame, and the voice of fear will create a lot of distractions. A lot of the inner work, like you said, quieting out the noise so that you can really make space for your true nature to come in. And it's learning to trust that voice that I think restores all of us. Mm-hmm.
And this is something that you work with your clients on a one-on-one basis, correct?
Yep.
Yeah.
And groups. I think that the fun part with groups is witnessing each other helps each other like learn different things. Yeah.
If one person unlocks something within them, it often helps the other people in that group unlock something within themselves, like an expedited form of unlocking your truth.
Yeah. I have been running a grief group called Rising since 2021. And it's a 6-month grief group designed to help people to live, love, and grieve meaningfully. It's curated for any type of loss, although I've been experimenting to design groups over particular losses. I think universally, though, people just want a space that will talk about intricate aspects to the grieving process. And I also run a group for anyone who has graduated from Rising. And that's kind of like part 2, imagine more life coaching and grief coaching, that marriage, truly taking action to rebuild the soul and the life rather than just grieving. And then you and I have started our grief group project just for the general public. That makes me really excited. And I also run other groups. Oh my God, I'm just realizing how much my life is about groups. There's a few other groups just for particular griefs that I'm helping people to do as well.
You're helping many and needed space for a lot of people. Nobody's exempt from grief in life. It's a matter of when it shows up in your life. And through these groups and through the information and the work that you walk people through, they can unlock that heaviness. And you also have a space for them as they evolve, as the group evolves, as their needs evolve, as their life evolves. So you take care of them in their darkest moment. You help them get through that. And then you also help them in the lighter moment. That consistency is extremely powerful.
Thank you. That's so beautifully put. Yeah, the way that I would describe it is if Rising was 6 months of intentionally letting you break down, just teaching someone it's safe to break down over and over and over again. The next group, which I call praise, because grief is praise. Praise is all about the breaking open. Like now that you've been so broken open by your grief and it's a little softer. Like what next? Like what does it mean to live from your values? And is the way you use your time a reflection of your values? So it's definitely, that big journey. And like you said, loss does not end after a program, but I hope my program teaches someone that they can trust themselves through loss.
Grief is praise. Tell me more about that.
I think the essence of it is witnessing, it's worshiping, it's a deep, sacred acknowledgement of whatever wants to be expressed, right? And I think that's grief's nature. Grief just wants to be witnessed. Grief is love that has nowhere to go. Grief is the most visceral expression of our humanity, that many things can exist at once, love and loss, fear and hope. So to me, grief is praise. It's one of the most.
That is so beautiful. So it's more about honoring that spiritual nature, that sacred part of it that wants to be acknowledged and witnessed. So where can people learn about this program and where can they sign on?
They can learn more by either staying connected with me on social media. I'm primarily active on Instagram and my handle is at Melinda Chinen. My website also has everything. It's like the biggest documentation of how all the Rising groups have gone in the past and just any of my offerings. And that's something else I want to acknowledge is I am a coach, but inherently I'm an artist, and coaching is just one of my favorite ways to make art. That's actually the only way my business has been able to evolve, is when I hold it as art and not as this like traditional Western model of business. I think life is art. So that's largely what people can find me.
Perfect. So I'll link her information in the show notes. And I love that you come from a place of art first, and the coaching is just an extension of that. Because when we limit ourselves to one thing, you can be a specialist in your craft, that's great, but we're multifaceted humans, evolve with time, who change. And tell us how that has helped you manifest who you are and evolve, and even how it's played into your grief process or the grief process of your clients. How has art touched your life?
Oh, art is so much more than what people think is just going to a museum and staring at some paintings. Art is a way of life. When we are born, there is actually no rule book. We think there is, and I think society has created that to create some form of control and safety. But when you start to dismantle all of your conditioning, you start to realize that, oh my gosh, I am the only one that can create my life on my terms. And that means like I have to really nurture my inner artist, my inner intuition, my nature, because that's going to be the paintbrush. That's what's going to guide me to creating a life of meaning. Because truth be told, if you just did everything right and then you're on your deathbed, I haven't met a single person that said, oh, wow, that was fulfilling because I did everything right, but I'm empty inside. That's not what we're designed to do. So I think it's really brave when someone quiets all the noise and distractions like we talked about, so that they can actually come from that inner knowing and paint their life as if it is art.
It's giving yourself permission to be creative, to be curious, to create without rules, and to experiment with your life in a way that's expansive. Let's use that word.
Oh, that's a great way of putting it. Yeah. The inner artist, it's so buoyant. Like it's not this dense. I think when we are coming from that place, and I'm thinking about my inner perfectionist, life is a boot camp, not a playground. But for the true artist, right, in all of us, that curiosity, that willingness to take risks, to not look at things not working out as just failures or something, a reflection of you. It creates more space for people to get up and just keep going and keep living a big life that we're designed to.
What other forms of art have you taken on? I know that last time we spoke, you said you were into writing. Yeah. How has art manifested other than the coaching side?
Oh, I should have said from the beginning, growing up as a sensitive child, art was my first love. I hated people. I'm surprised I'm in this career because I wanted nothing to do with people, and I just wanted to draw and write. So I feel like I've come full circle because I actually did abandon that. That was part of my journey of when I started to people please and be what everyone else wanted from me. I lost the art. So now I'm relearning that I love to write, and it's so natural. And a lot of my writings are part of my impact. So I'll write just from experiences, but also sometimes short stories to summarize like other lessons. I also love to paint, and that's something that I'm trying to experiment with because a year ago I was deep in watercolor and I took a lot of classes for it. And now I'm trying to transition to discovering other forms of painting like oil and acrylic. So that's to come. But yeah, who knows? There's so much more I haven't touched that I want to.
I love that. Well, hopefully we get to see how that evolves. I'm sure it's a way to also transmute that potentially heavy energy that we absorb sometimes and release it.
A good way of putting it. All the other forms of art definitely help me to release what I take on.
Yeah. That's one of the things that startled me the most about grief, is that it was so physical. I was expecting all the feeling. I was not expecting the physical manifestations of it. So it's just getting our head out of the way and being physical, like doing art or exercising or yoga or whatever modality you want to do, and allowing the sacred part of that wisdom to take over.
Absolutely. That reminds me, life is meant to be lived, not just intellectualized. We have to live our life. And I think art, any type of somatic work that gets us into our body gives us access to actually being here instead of just control and managing our life.
I love that. Is there anything that I haven't touched on that you want to bring up about your experiences, about grief, about Paige, about your practice, anything about that?
I don't think so. You asked such beautiful questions. I feel really fulfilled. So grateful for you and this platform.
Likewise. And part of the reason why we decided to collaborate on the virtual grief meetups, they're going to be over Zoom. We'll also add the link for those events on the show notes. And you can visit Melinda's profile or my own for more information. We're going to do that until the end of the year. And we'll extend an invitation to anybody who wants community. I will link all of that in the show notes. So with that said, thank you so much, Melinda, for being here. Before we leave, I have just one question. What would Melinda today tell 15-year-old Melinda?
Oh, you're going to make me cry. That's so
it's
beautiful.
A tough question. Yeah.
Oh, what would she say? What I would say to her is, you have no clue how much you can trust yourself. No clue, but let life break you open 1,000 times. It'll all be worth it.
Thank you, Melinda.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina.